Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. This is Laura with Laura B. Flosstube. Thank you so much for joining me. I am so glad that you have tuned in for yet again a Bloom Quilt Sew Along video. We are so close at this point. I have gotten all 20 of my blocks sewn together, all 5 rows. We are good to go with the inner workings of our quilt top. All we have to do is put on that outer border and we are ready to quilt. Can you believe it? That is so crazy. I feel like it was just yesterday when we were like, okay, here's block 1. And now we are like, woohoo, outer border time. So I have selected my outer border fabric. I am so excited about this, you guys. I had fabric left over from my hometown quilt. This is what I used on the back of that quilt. And it is still just the yardage. It's 42-inch yardage. Bought it at one of the local quilt shops here close to me, and I absolutely love it so much, and I think it's going to be perfect on the outside of this quilt. So I need to measure my quilt top, get my borders cut, and get those on. So let's get to it. If this is your first quilt, or if you're just a newer quilter and you don't have much experience with outer borders, you may think it's fine just to follow the pattern and cut the borders the lengths that it tells you to. But what you may not know is that we're not perfect. Sometimes we may be off just a little bit with that 1/4-inch seam, and sometimes we might have a little bit more or a little bit less than what the cutting guide tells us. So it's always a good idea to make sure you measure your quilt top and get it the right length and width for your borders. If you don't, then you run the risk of having your borders all wavy, it's not going to quilt good, and you're not going to be happy with the finished result. So let me show you how you can measure your borders quick and easy and get that length and width for your outside borders. If you're like me, you may be super jealous of all those designers that have huge rooms, that have these amazing mats and huge cutting tables, and they can just lay the entire quilt out there and measure it, and it's like no problem whatsoever. Well, that's not the world I live in. I have an 18 by 24 inch mat on my table, and that is the biggest mat that I can have in my craft room. So in order for me to measure my quilt, I gotta be a little creative. So what I do is I take my quilt top and I fold it in half. And then I take that edge and I put it on my cutting mat, and I already know that it's too wide for my cutting mat. Oh, crap. Okay, so we're gonna do it one more time. No, this isn't gonna get me as accurate as if I had a place to lay it all out, but I promise it's gonna be close enough. Now it's folded into quarters, and I'm gonna lay it on my mat, and this is at the top edge of the quilt. And I have 13, and if I stretch it just a little bit, 13 1/8. So I'm going to write that number down. And now I'm going to go down the quilt about halfway, and I'm going to grab a sashing strip so I know it's even, and I'm going to do the same thing. And I have 13 1/4. Now I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom of the quilt. Again, fold the quilt top in half, stretch it out, edges to edges, pop it a little bit, and measure here. And here I have 13 1/4. Okay, so remember at the top I had 13 1/8, and then 2 more measurements down I have 13 1/4. So basically what you want to do is you take those and you're going to average them. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, it was 13 1/4 2 of the 3 places. So 13 1/4 times 4 is what my top and bottom borders need to be. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the length of the quilt. And you can do this with any size quilt top. You know, I mean, like the largest quilt top I make is a king size quilt, and those typically are like 110 by 120. And I'm going to tell you right now, sometimes I get out the yardstick, which is also really good. Not quite as accurate as your cutting mat, but it works. All right, so here is the left edge, and it is 16 1/4. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to find about the middle of my quilt, And I'm going to line it up on a sashing strip, remember, because that way I know I'm in the same spot all the way across the quilt. And that is 16.5. Like I told you, that 1/4 inch seam, it'll get you every time. And now on the right side of the quilt, line up those edges, lining up the corners basically. Pulling that out, folding it into a 1/4. Giving that a good pop. And this is 16 1/4. So I'm going to say I was probably just a little off in the middle somehow. So we're going to go with 16 1/4 times 4, and that's going to be our left and right side border length. So when we do the math on those, all right, now that we know what the width and length are of our quilt, we need to figure out our borders. Our borders are a 4.5 inch border according to the cutting guide. Now, if you make it wider or narrower, you're going to have to adjust these numbers. But for me, the top and bottom is 13 1/4 times 4. And that's giving me 26, 52, 53 inches before I add the borders. Now I'm also going to do the left and right. And the left and right borders are the ones we sew on first. So this is going to be a straight measurement. So I have 16 1/4 times 4. So 32, 64, 65 inches. So 65 inches is my left and right border length. That's easy enough. Okay, so for our top border, we have to figure our borders or side borders that we add on to the quilt. So we have 53 inches to begin with. Then we're going to add on another 9 inches on either end, but you lose 1/2 inch on each one of those because of the seams. So you're really only adding on 4 1/4. And you can do this one of two ways. You can either say that your quilt top is actually 52.5 after when you sew on those side borders, plus another 8.5, or you can do a little quicker math by saying, okay, my quilt top's 53, I'm adding the 9, so that's 62, and then I'm losing 1/2 inch on either side because of that seam allowance. And that's going to take me down to 61. So my top and bottom borders are going to be 61 inches. Quilt math can be so difficult. The best thing I can tell you to do is, if you're really having problems with that, there are definitely some calculators online that you can go and put in your numbers, and it will tell you what widths and which lengths to cut your borders. The other thing that I like to do is draw it out. So like if I have a picture, I'll take my quilt and I'll say, okay, this is 53. I'm adding on the 4.5 and the 4.5. 53, if I didn't have any seams there, that's 62. But I do have 2 seams on either side, and I'm losing 1/2 inch because I lose 1/4 inch off the top and 1/4 inch off the border on both sides. So I lose 1/2 inch on each side, so I lose 1 inch off each side. So 53 plus 9 minus 1 gives me the 61 inches for the top and bottom borders. So when I cut out my border strips, that's what I'm going to cut them at. I'm going to cut 65 for left and right, so they sew those babies on and be happy. I'll just cut out 61 for top and bottom. Now you're going to say, you can't cut 61 out of 42 inches. Well, I know. We're going to have to cut multiple strips. Now, in order to figure out how many strips you want, this is what you have to do. You have to think, again, do a little math. So I need 61 for top and bottom, so that's 122. I need a 65 for left and right, and that's 130. So that's 130 and 122 is 252, and then you gotta divide that by 42 inches. Now I typically divide by 40 because it's a little easier, and I can say that 240 goes into 47 times. So I'm gonna need 7 strips for my border fabrics. No, 240 goes into 246 times, so I know I need 7 border strips. I always cut 1 extra just because it gives me a little wiggle room. Now, if you really care, just go to the calculator and do the math and let it do it for you. If you don't want to calculate it out yourself, that's usually what I end up doing. But for video today, I'm just going to tell you I know I need 7 strips. All right, we're going to cut into some beautiful fabric. We need 4.5 inch strips for our border, and we need 7 of them. So I like to take my fabric, line up the edges. Now when you're cutting wide strips like this, you definitely want to make sure that you're doing a few things so you don't get those little peaks and things on the fold. So that's why I like lining up the edges, and then I line it up on a line on my cutting mat. And then the last thing I'll do is I'm going to trim off one of the sides. This is what happens when you have too many projects on your table. Oh, so many projects, so little time. All right, just to get my fabric nice and squared up, I'm going to cut off just a little bit here. I know some of you will keep that for some string piecing and things. I am not a string piecing girl, so that's not me. I do have a friend that I sometimes give those little pieces to because she likes that, and she also uses them to stuff pet beds. All right, so there's 2. And 7. Now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to take all of those strips over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew them together end to end so we can cut our border strips. All right, to sew my border strips together, I just have a pile of them right here on my sewing table, and I'm just going to flip the first one back and start sewing them with a 1/4 inch seam. Now when I sew my outside border strips together, the one thing I like to do is do a back stitch at the beginning and the end of that seam. I do that because it's the outside border. So when you put it on the long arm, you don't want that seam pulling apart. All of those seams on the inside workings of your quilt top, they interlock, and they're all gonna like kind of lock into place, but you still have some of those on the outside edge. If they don't have anything locking them, then they could pull apart. So that's where your outside border comes into handy. You need to make sure that those seams are all secure. So when your long armor, or if you are your long armor, go to put that on your quilting machine, they don't pull apart or start to give. All right? So I'm just going to sew all of these together with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we'll start measuring and cutting. With a very, very long piece of 4.5 inch wide fabric. All 7 of my strips are sewn together. And what I want to do is cut my borders out of this. So I'm going to cut my borders 2 at a time. And I'm going to do that by cutting the shorter border, and then the rest of my fabric should work out to cut my other 2 borders. If not, then I measured wrong somewhere, and you know, it happens. So we'll work it out as we go. So as I mentioned, my cutting mat is only 24 inches long, but I want to cut my top and bottom borders, and they are 61. So half of that is 30.5. So what I'm going to do is I am going to put my 6-inch ruler hanging off the end of my 24-inch mat. And I usually try to pick a number like 10. So it's easy to keep in mind where I should be cutting. Let me swing it down here so it makes more sense. All right, so here is my 6-inch ruler. And I'm going to take the end of my borders that are cut, and I'm going to place them on the cutting mat. Then I'm going to take the rest of this border and fold it over. I take my border fabric and I let it hang off of my mat. And I know that folded, I have this on the 7. The cut end is on the 1. So I know that I have 30 inches of fabric here. And I need to cut it at 30 1/2 to get to the 61. Now, if you're concerned about your fold down here, you can take a ruler and kind of slip it in here and pull it and make sure that that is good and taut. I like that word. I don't know why, but I do. And then you're just going to kind of move this until you get 30 1/2 inches, which on my 24-inch mat, I'm actually going to take this to the 8-inch mark because then I don't have to go quite as far on my mat. Okay, so there's 8 and 22 is 30 1/4. And I need 30 1/2. So we're going to cut this at the 30 1/2 mark down here. And I know you're like, there is no 30 1/2 mark down there, but there is because, like I said, the 23 on the mat and the 8 hanging off. So here are my 61-inch borders. And I still have a ton of fabric left, which is good because I'm going to need it for the other borders. So now if I put these end to end, I always like to double check myself just to make sure. And I'll be quite honest with you and tell you that sometimes I am not right. And sometimes I have to recut, but that's okay. All right. So there is 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. Oh, we are a little off. But it's always good to cut a little bigger than not. All right, so that's there. This is here. So 30 1/2 and 30 1/2 is 61. All right, so there are the top and bottom borders. Now, sometimes I label these if I'm not going to sew them on immediately, and sometimes I put them on my design wall or something, but I think we're going to keep this straight, I hope. These are enough, different enough that I'm pretty confident we can keep these straight. Now, with the rest of this border fabric, we're just going to fold it in half. And really, it doesn't matter if these ends meet. It doesn't really matter what those ends are doing. It only matters that this end over here is folded really tightly against itself. That way you have two borders of the same size. And again, stick that ruler in there and get it nice and tight. And these are 65 inches. Oh goodness, we have to do some math on that one. 65, be 32 1/2. So we're going to go ahead and say here is 10. Right, there's 10, 32 1/2. Because 10 and 22 are 32 1/2. Before we cut, we're going to think about that for a second. 32 and 32 is 64, and a half is 65. Okay. All right, so we do have a little extra, but that's okay. That can go into our scrap pile. It could possibly be used for another quilt. Now, the next thing we get to do is pin these borders onto our quilt, and I'll show you a couple tricks for that too. Okay, you may remember that I said that we have to put our left and right borders on the quilt first. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna lay my quilt on the table, and again, I don't have a big space, you guys, so this is how I make it work. If you have a great big table, I'm so happy for you, but I do not. So, I'm going to find my center block on my quilt, and I'm going to use the sashing as my guide, and I'm going to match those 2 points up. And I'm going to run my finger along that sashing, and I'm going to use my finger here and just kind of make a mark. And that is the center point of this side of my quilt. So now when I put this on my table, I know the center of my border should go to the center of my quilt. And that's where I am going to start pinning. Okay, so like I said, I'll lay this on the edge of my table, and I kind of use my body weight to keep it on there. Sometimes I will grab other things, kind of like my extremely heavy rotary cutter and things like that, to just kind of help with that. Now, one thing I did do that I didn't show you was I took my border and I took it to my ironing board, and I ironed a really nice sharp crease in the middle of that border. So I can match that up with the little finger crease that I just did, and I'll put a pin right there, because I know that's the center of my quilt and the center of my border, and in theory, those should align. Now I'll stretch out my border, and I'll put a pin at the end of that, or on the edge. And then I will just kind of work my way up along this edge, making sure I kind of give those a little pull, just to make sure this is good and flat along there, and putting in some pins as I go. Like I said, I don't have a big table. I wish I did, but I do not. Whew, you almost heard a loud bang. That's okay. That happens in my craft room too. All right, so now I take the other end of that border and put it on the other corner of my quilt on that side. Because remember, I already have the center mark, so I don't, it's already pinned, it's good. And then I can take this. I kind of wanted to show this process just because some of us are, quilting at the dining room table, right? We don't have big glamorous craft rooms that we have the ability to have huge cutting tables and tables where we can use for squaring things up and, doing all the best practices we see all the designers do, right? All right, so now that one is pinned. And if you're confident in your pinning, you can go and find the center of your other one with the same process. I'm gonna fold that sashing on that center block, pull that out, use my thumbnail to make a mark. Put that just like that. Rotary cutter for the weight. I keep meaning to get some of the dumbbells, I guess. But I haven't yet. All right, and I'm going to match those center points up. Match up the edges and just pin along. Remember to move that this time. Yeah. Pin at my lower edge. Give that a good little tug. like to give it kind of a little tug, and then I pin somewhere in the middle, and then you can kind of pin the other, sections. It's kind of finding the middle of the middle, I guess. I'm using Quilter Select glass-headed pens, by the way. I love them because they're in a magnetic case. So I'll just set that magnetic case on my sewing machine. Oof, that was kind of loud. Sorry about that, guys. Now I will take all of this to the sewing machine and sew on my side borders. This is just some straight stitch sewing. There is nothing fancy here. I will do a back stitch at the beginning and end. Even though that top and bottom border are going to interlock those seams, I just kind of like doing that with my outside borders. It kind of gives me just a little extra peace of mind, I guess. I'm not sure why. So I am going to get started on the side borders, and then I'll pin the top and bottom using the same exact method, and then we'll get up on the design wall and you can see what it looks like. We have a completed bloom quilt top. I am so happy with how this turned out. I love all the blocks. I love the scrappiness feel. I love that I used so many scraps up from my stash to get this done. I love that I was able to find some fabric for my outer border in my stash rather than buying more for this quilt. So I'm at the point now that I could take it and quilt it. Except for one thing. Time. I don't know when I'm going to get to the point where I can actually quilt this quilt top, and I definitely don't know when it's going to be done with the binding and the sleeve and all of that. I will try to post the videos when I get to that point, but you may have yours done before me, and that's okay. It's not a race. I am so glad you joined me on the journey to get to this point. I hope you've picked up some tips and tricks along the way. I hope you've figured out ways to just make do with what you have, rather than buying more or expecting more or needing more. And that's really kind of the ultimate goal for me this year. So anyway, with all of that being said, I am so thankful for everyone who's played along with this little quilt sew along. Thank you for liking and subscribing and following my channel. Thank you so much for sharing the videos out. Thank you for all the encouragement I've received on social media. Thanks for all your comments on the videos each week. I really, really do appreciate all of your input and your support and our virtual friendship. So I hope you've enjoyed the Bloom Quilt Sew Along. Please stay tuned because I do plan on doing another sew along really soon. But until next time, happy stitching!